are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the solved case of the restaurant turned murder house. This was a place that almost felt like home to people, a work environment that was loved by all of the employees, and a job that so many relied on to support their families. Now, the Brown's Chicken Massacre was something that one couldn't think up in their worst nightmares, and they definitely couldn't stomach it once it actually happened. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. By the way, I want to give a huge thank you to the Daily Herald, which did a huge report of this case. There are many different segments in it, as well as information about the victims, the actual investigation, and it was just a wonderful source to find information on this case. So I will link it down below if you'd like to read even more in detail about it. But now let's get back to the story. So it was 1993 in Illinois, and the Ehlenfeldt family lived in Palatine. Now this was Richard and Lynn, who were husband and wife, and their 3 daughters. However, to get to that point, they had to meet somewhere, so let's travel a little farther back. And this is when Richard was still a child, and he lived in a pretty small town in Wisconsin, and he also had a father who was the mayor of this small town for a while. He was a really hard worker, really good student, and went on to the University of Wisconsin. Now this is actually where he would meet Lynn, who was also going to that college, and they instantly bonded over their religious views and their backgrounds, and they just felt that connection immediately. But they had actually met during a volunteering program where they were trying to set up this supper club amongst the university and the college students, and that is when their paths crossed, and it quickly turned into a full-blown relationship. Now by the time they were 22 and 21, Richard and Lynn actually eloped. They didn't want a big fancy wedding. They just went and they got married, and that was that. But this actually shocked all of their family and friends. There was no fancy wedding, there was no huge guest list. These two had simply drove to another state and become husband and wife. And looking back on it, their family members said that it did kind of make sense for them, because they were the type that loved to actually do things. They weren't really the planners who just sat and dreamed about things they wanted to do. They were more likely to just go and do it and make things happen and not wait until it was the right time, but make the right time for themselves. And Richard was also a type A personality who thrived on a challenge, and so they would just go and do things whenever they wanted, whenever they got the feeling to. And so it kind of did make sense that they just wanted to get it done, that one day they realized they wanted to be married, and that's what they did. After this, Richard began to work behind the scenes with a big politician, and Lynn was also working in social services at the time. And in their home life, they actually ran a halfway house, which was a place where female inmates could come and basically get themselves on their feet again and make sure that they were re-entering society better than they had come out of it, and that they were going to have a better chance at a future than just going back into the same path that they had always been in. When they had their daughters, Jennifer, Dana, and Joy, every 2 years, they decided that it was time to have Lynn become a stay-at-home mother. Richard was making enough in his government jobs, and so with Lynn really wanting to be home with her girls, they decided that was the best thing for everyone, and so that's what they did. But this was unfortunate because Richard would actually start to kind of lose his jobs and have to bounce around to different jobs, and they would have to move a lot for that, and eventually he would get laid off. And so Lynn decided to go back and try to search for different jobs herself. The girls were about teenagers by the time this happened, so, she didn't need to be right by their side all the time taking care of them. So she decided she would try to look for jobs, but with neither of them having any luck doing so, they came upon another plan. Another way for them to make money and, be happy in what they were doing and hopefully have a, retirement to look forward to in the future. And that is when they would decide they were going to get in on a franchise. Richard and Lynn decided that they were going to own a restaurant, but an easier thing than just opening up your own restaurant is joining a franchise, so you can open up an already existing restaurant that already has customers and people already know what it is, and they can of course have business from the very beginning in a new area. And so this is kind of like McDonald's everywhere. They all have different owners, and you always see the same things in McDonald's. It's the same menu. People expect a McDonald's to be a McDonald's, so there are certain rules and regulations that you have to kind of have a certain standard set to. And they decided that they were going to open a Brown's Chicken, which was really popular in the area. It had been started in Chicago, Illinois, so it was nearby. People knew what it was, but there just wasn't one in the immediate area. So they saw that as an opportunity to create one. The closest one was 30 minutes away, and so for people in the immediate community, this was really incredible because now they didn't have to drive 30 minutes to just go get their favorite fast food. And this was actually fried chicken that they served, and so many people loved the restaurant and were so excited to have it closer to them. Now, that is exactly what they did in 1992. They opened up this Brown's Chicken and Pasta, and they had to actually put $300,000 into it, which was pretty much all of their savings and retirement, but they figured that, they would make that money back, and they would also be able to hopefully make this an investment for the future. They didn't want to work there forever. That wasn't their ultimate goal. It wasn't their ultimate dream, but this is what they were doing to survive, to have money. But they didn't realize at the time how much of a sacrifice that this would become, because this would take a lot of work from the very beginning. And of course, like I said, their girls were teenagers and they started graduating and having, goodbye parties, graduation parties, proms. And their parents weren't really able to go to these parties because they were busy with the restaurant, making sure everything was going okay, managing it, and hiring people to help them. And in fact, one of their daughters said at her graduation party, her father never came, and her mother did, only for a brief second, to deliver the chicken. Other than that, she didn't see them at all. And of course, her parents wanted to be there, but they just simply couldn't. They were trying to hire more employees that were, good employees that they could count on. But of course, that's sometimes hard to do. You never know when you hire somebody if they're going to be a hard worker, if they're going to help your business or ultimately harm it. And so they were still, trying to find the balance within this year that they had been open of people who worked hard, people who had open schedules, and they had come upon 5 people, which they really did feel like were a good fit for the restaurant. This was Rico Solis, who was 17 years old, Michael Castro, who was 16, as well as 46-year-old Guadalupe Maldonado, and 32-year-old Thomas Mennes, as well as Marcus Nellsen, who was 31. Now, Rico and Michael were good employees, but they could only work part-time because they were still so young. They were 16 and 17. They were still in high school, so they only could work when they weren't in school. And Michael had been there the longest. He was the first one hired, and he had stayed all throughout this year, and he was known as such a hard-working guy. He could work on all different types of things. If they needed to throw him at the cash register, he could do that. Throw him in the back to cook, he could do that. He was very adaptable, and so they really counted on him to kind of, do the things when other people were failing while doing them or just slacking in general. But he also had a fun side to him. He loved playing video games and the piano, and he also loved to write love letters for girls and play pranks on his friends. Michael wanted to join the Marine Corps after graduation and become an aeronautical engineer, and people in the neighborhood, people who just knew Michael, loved him. In fact, there was this kid in his neighborhood that had been being bullied, and Michael kind of took him under his wing and decided to teach him how to overcome it and how to be better from the bullying and to not let it get to him. And he would often, drive up and take him on rides and just try to put him in a better spirit from dealing with so much at school. And this boy really looked up to Michael, thinking that he was his hero. Michael was such a caring guy that when his friend Rico was asking people if they knew of any jobs open, Michael immediately went to his employer and he asked Lynn and Richard if they could hire Rico, and that he was a hard worker and that he would do great. And that is exactly what they did. They hired him, and they were really happy to have him on board because he was just as hard of a worker as Michael. He would in fact prove to be amazing at his job. He was much more mature than kids his age, and this was said to be because he had kind of a harder past. He had lived in the Philippines growing up, and his father had actually been murdered. And so he kind of dealt with all that trauma as a child, but then his mother actually got remarried and moved to America. But in order to get everybody situated and wait for the children to be able to come over to America with her, all of her children stayed with her grandparents, but they were kind of a bit older and didn't really watch them that well. And so Rico, being the oldest, kind of took on the role of a fatherly figure, and he took care of them for quite a long while until they could come over to America. He was known to his family as their protector, and they all appreciated him so much, and Rico didn't hold a grudge for the fact that he had to grow up fast or that he had to watch his siblings. He did it willingly. He did it happily. He wanted to help, and when he got to America, he decided that he was going to do something with his life, that he was going to drive fast cars, that he was going to enlist in the army, and that he was going to be better than anybody believed he could be. Then came Guadalupe, Thomas, and Marcus, who were all a bit older than Michael and Rico, but they had been hired after them and were definitely a good addition to this staff. Now, Guadalupe loved cooking, and he was actually from Mexico and had a farm there with his family, but he would often come to America to get different jobs as a cook to make some money. And so he had this certain restaurant that he would always go to. However, it had closed down during a time when he was back in Mexico. So when he came back this one time, he realized it was closed, and he decided that he was going to try to get a job at Brown's Chicken. And they gave one to him, and he would work to make some good money. He was said to be a good man, but a tough man, but he was willing to do anything to help somebody else. Marcus was a bit older, and he had a bit more of a past. He was actually a army veteran, and he had a 7-year-old daughter with his ex-wife. He and his ex-wife had actually divorced because he was struggling with alcohol addiction, and they just couldn't last through that. And he, at this point in his life, when he got a job at Brown's Chicken, was really trying to turn his life around. He had gone to rehab. He was working this steady job now, and you could just tell that he wanted a better life for himself, and he was working towards that every single day. His 7-year-old girl, he cherished every single moment that he could be with her. He sent all of his money to her for child support, but even more than that, he would send literally every cent he had, to the point where he would have none and not be able to even feed himself because he wanted his daughter to have the best life possible. Thomas was known as being quite the peaceful human who really just loved hunting but refused to actually hunt the animals, and he just had a rough time in life, but he chose to, see the light in everything. And in fact, one of the jobs that he was a dishwasher at, it was at a Perkins, and he had gone one day for his shift and realized that the restaurant had closed down and nobody had told him. And so then of course he was scrambling for jobs, and that eventually led him to Brown's Chicken. And there Thomas was known to walk the fellow employees, especially the women, to their cars or, their bicycles or whatever they rode there, in order to make sure they were safe. And he didn't do this like creepily. I know that sounds a bit weird, but he would just walk with them to make sure that they were okay before they left. And so there was, nothing going on at night in the dark, so they weren't scared. And he was said to be one of the sweetest guys. When his friends wanted him to call in sick, he said that he couldn't because he had people who were counting on him at the restaurant to be there. These 7 beautiful souls were working at the restaurant one night on January 8th. The restaurant at 168 West Northwest Highway closed at 9. And so they would be doing their closing duties, and they would all go home for a good night's rest for the next day, which was a Saturday, which would be busy as well. However, that is not what would happen this night. You see, 16-year-old Michael's mother began to get worried when it was well past closing time and Michael still hadn't returned. This was not like him at all. She knew that Friday night was a busy night. It could take a bit longer for the closing duties to be finished, but it shouldn't have been taking hours longer. And so while she was getting worried, she actually got a call from Rico's mother saying, "Is Michael home yet?" Because Rico still isn't. And of course, because these boys were still teenagers living under their family's roofs, they were going to be extremely nervous about where their boys were, and they hadn't said anything about going out after the work or anything like that. Guadalupe's family was also getting anxious because he was always trying to make it home before his children would go to bed so he could help to put them to sleep, and he wasn't rushing home. He wasn't home at all hours later, and this was not okay for Guadalupe to not come home. And so at this point, everyone was contacting the police, and that is when the police would eventually go to the restaurant and they would find Guadalupe's vehicle, which was a Cutlass Sierra, in the parking lot, as well as Michael's white Nissan pickup with the U.S. Marine sticker on the back window. Now, other vehicles were in the parking lot as well, but they knew, or they thought, that the restaurant was closed because the lights were off and nobody seemed to be inside. So they started going around the building. They saw no signs of anyone or any sort of struggle, and that is when they saw the back door ajar. This was kind of where the employees would come and go, and it was open. The building was dark, the phone inside was ringing over and over again, and the police had actually checked this building several times before actually finding the door ajar. They had been hearing that all of these employees were missing, but they hadn't really thought that anything was wrong. It was a busy night for the police department, and they had drove by, but they didn't see anything wrong, so they just kept driving until about 3 a.m. when they finally decided that they should go and look. And this was when the real search began, and Michael's father was actually there and went inside with them, and that's when he saw his son's jacket, and it was cold. He wouldn't have left the restaurant without his jacket, and so he knew that Michael should still be inside. And that is when he tried to move forward, but was stopped by officers who said that this was now a crime scene and who shoved him back out the door. What he hadn't seen was the arm hanging out from behind the freezer door and the pool of blood surrounding it. This arm belonged to Lynn, and the sergeant called the deputy saying, "I'm at the Brown's Chicken, boss, and we've got a bunch of dead people in the cooler." The town would never be the same after those words left his lips, and if that wasn't horrific enough, the sergeant would then say, "I'm wrong. There are more dead people in the other cooler." There were 7 bodies in total, the whole staff for that night, and none had survived. Richard and Thomas were in one cooler and the other 5 employees were huddled together in the other. They had gunshot wounds from a .38 caliber or a .357 caliber gun, as well as some of them having stab wounds or cuts, and they had all been shot to death, but Lynn also had a gash in her throat, and Michael had been stabbed in the stomach. Marcus had an injury to his head, and they all seemed to have injury to their hands, as though they had put them up to try to protect themselves. It was a massacre. There was blood everywhere, and 20 shots were fired from the same gun. It wasn't long before swarms of people started showing up at the restaurant. Reporters, photographers, the community, they were all just waiting outside to hear what had happened. And the thing was, the police didn't even know what happened or why. And so the reporters had actually heard this over the police scanner and come immediately. And of course, the investigators didn't want the victims' families to hear this over the news, so they immediately sent out for people to inform them. They asked some local pastors to help in telling the victims' families and to let them down as easily as you can in a situation like this. Flowers were also sent to their home, but of course, grief and the loss of a loved one is not something that's easy to comprehend. Rico's families seemed to be the ones that kind of took it the worst, because this kind of triggered what they had already gone through with Rico's father being murdered, and it was happening again. And after finally, coming to terms with what had happened to their father, or at least, having time to heal from it, now this same thing was just reoccurring, and it felt like a nightmare to them all over again. And they actually fled their home and they went to stay in a hotel to just get away from everything. And grief counselors were also brought in for all of the families to help them cope. The investigators were back at the restaurant, hard at work, digging into this crime scene. They actually found half-eaten chicken bones in the trash, as though, a meal had just been eaten and thrown away, and they took those for evidence in case in the future they could come in handy. They also found in the safe that money was taken, but there was some left in the back. That was just like a wad of cash in this safe. But $1,800 had been stolen from the safe, and the key was still in the lock, and this key was normally around Lynn's wrist, so it appeared as though she had had to open it, or they had stolen the key from her and opened it themselves. Of course, investigators were looking at this as having a motive of robbery, and they didn't know if this was just a robbery gone wrong or if they had the intention of murder as well. And this was especially thought to be the motive because restaurants in the area had also been robbed during this time, and they worried that it could even possibly be connected, and that these robbers were stepping it up and changing their MO to murder as well. In the back of the restaurant, they found blood-stained streaks on the floor, as though somebody had tried to clean up possibly their footsteps on the ground, but had just left the mop with the blood on the actual mop and on the handle as well. The police deputy chief had arranged for Lynn and Richard's, the owner's daughters, to actually do a interview with the reporters, because the reporters kept hounding them at their home, wouldn't leave them alone for interviews, and they were dealing with the loss of their parents. And so the police chief decided that they would do an interview so it would get them off of their backs and leave them alone. That was the deal. If they did this interview, they had to leave them alone afterwards, and so they did so. 2 of their daughters had actually been scheduled to work at the restaurant that night, but for one reason or another hadn't been there, and they kind of had a little bit of survivor's guilt as well. A boy named Jason also worked at the restaurant and had asked for this specific night off months prior, and of course could have never predicted that something like this could have happened, but it was just so baffling to him that that was the one night he took off when he never took off before. Another female employee felt the same, because she was named Casey, and she actually was supposed to work that night, and she had gone in, but Rico had actually come in and said that he would take her shift if she wanted to be off that night, and she took him up on that offer. So she really should have been there instead of Rico, and this really got to her. She said she actually almost went into the restaurant about 9 p.m. that night to talk to Lynn, and if she would have done that, she could have been there right as they were being murdered. It was actually found that Rico had been thinking about quitting the Brown's Chicken, not because he disliked his employers or really, the pay or anything like that, but it was because he worked with the chicken fryer and it kind of splattered the grease and coated his skin and his hair, and he felt like he could never get it off no matter how much he tried to shower it off. And so he wasn't really happy with what he was doing, and Lynn and Richard had heard him and had said that they would love to give him a promotion with more money, and they would also kind of transfer him to being a cashier instead, just to make him happier. And they really were the type of employers that everybody wants, that actually listen to their employees when they say they're not happy. Guadalupe also shouldn't have been there that night. He was taking the place of another employee named Kelso because Guadalupe was new and he wanted to get in more hours. And Lynn's daughter, Dana, should have also been at the restaurant as well, but Lynn said she could have the night off and she would take the shift over for her. Now, of course, all of these people who should have been there and weren't could have never expected this would happen, but it didn't change the fact that they felt guilty, that they had survived, and the people who helped them out had not. Now, investigators were extremely worried that this was going to happen at other restaurants. It was going to continue happening, and so they actually had a huge meeting with local businesses in order to discuss ways to improve their security and to keep their employees safe. Family members of the victims said that investigators were doing okay once the investigation had started. However, they didn't know if they did the best job when it first began, because they said they could have looked into the restaurant much sooner than they did. I mean, family members had started calling as early as 9:30, 10, and possibly if they would have gotten there during that time, they could have stopped all of this from happening. Investigators had heard all of their concerns that night and didn't even try to connect them or go see if something was wrong, and it took them hours later until 3 a.m. to finally do something. But now investigators were bringing in the FBI as well as different police stations to help them in this investigation, and 200 fingerprints were actually found at this crime scene. But the problem was this was a public restaurant, and that meant that these fingerprints could be from anyone who had eaten there. But they had no idea how to tell if this was the killer or killers, or if they had anything to do with what had happened. The cash register did show that the last thing that was purchased was actually after closing at 9:08 p.m. and it was a 4-piece chicken meal. And this is what was thought to be found in the trash can that they had taken in for evidence. And this would actually come back in the investigation later on as being a huge help. Of course, investigators then tried to reconstruct the crime scene and a timeline in order to kind of figure out what could have happened. And they believe that whoever ordered this 4-piece chicken meal had come into the restaurant that night, had ordered this, and then had sat down in a booth at the front next to the artificial Christmas garland loops above the windows. And in the back during this time, Richard was putting on a warmer shirt to go into the cooler to do some inventory, which Thomas was going to help him with. Marcus and Guadalupe were helping with cleaning up the food in the preparation area, where Michael and Rico were helping with the other closing chores, so as soon as these men were done eating, they could all leave. Lynn was counting the receipts for that day, putting money in the safe, and she had no idea, none of them had any idea that they were in danger until a gun was pointed at them, possibly more than one. And Lynn was then thought to have been forced to open this safe, but there were 2 different compartments, and she was either thought to only want to open one, or that she couldn't get the second one open, which is why there was still money left. But it was opened in this other compartment. Richard's credit card and Thomas's watch were found to be hidden in the cooler that they were found in, as though they were protecting their items. Possibly they heard a robbery happening outside and they wanted to keep their items safe and didn't think it was going to escalate into their murders. And Michael and Marcus were also found to have wounds that indicated that they tried to fight back but were unfortunately unsuccessful. The killer or the killers then cut the power at the switch box, which stopped the clocks, and this was at 9:52 p.m. and that is when they were said to leave. And it was believed that this could be more than one killer due to how many people they would have had to overcome. And in fact, it could have been 2 to 4 killers. And they believed that they were about 18 to 25 due to the lack of planning that happened. But the day after the murders, a tip would actually be called in by a woman who said she knew a man who had worked at Brown's Chicken a week prior, but who had been fired. His name was Martin E. Blake. He was 23 and he lived in Elgin, and he had a .22 caliber gun, which he had been seen recently shooting down his hallway into phone books. He was kind of losing it mentally, and she said he was also threatening revenge. So he seemed like a darn good possible suspect. But the strange behavior of this man only got worse as investigators started looking into his personal life, and his friends said he was being cocky about the murders and also that he smiled anytime they came on the news. Looking deeper into Martin Blake, they also found he had a connection to one of the victims. Michael Castro had a sister, and Martin had dated her. Now, they began to monitor Martin. Little did they know he'd actually been told that he was on their radar by another friend of his, but they were watching him from a neighbor's house. And that is when, Saturday at around 2:56 p.m., they saw Martin walk out of his house, and he went to his car, which didn't start, so then he went to the front of it and was opening the hood, and this is when he would be swarmed by dozens of police officers and they would arrest him. The first words out of his mouth were, "Is this about last night?" And he was still apparently hungover. Martin was questioned. He said he didn't do it. He said he was actually getting high with a group of his friends at his house that night, and so his friends were contacted for a possible alibi, and they said that they were over there at around 7 to 9 watching a movie called Revolver. Martin was said to want to go rent a movie called Faces of Death, which is about people being killed, and his friends didn't want to go. They wanted to just hang out there, so he went by himself, and he left around 9:15 and got back around 11 p.m. While investigators searched his home, he sat in the jail saying, "God, if you get me out of here, I'm going to do something really good." 48 hours later, he was still being questioned, but he passed a polygraph test and was released. Martin actually had to flee Illinois because of all of the media outlets talking about him constantly as being a suspect, even though he had been cleared. He actually sued for false arrest and got a bunch of money and a settlement later on. Now, do you remember the meal that was collected from the trash? Well, it was brought in to be tested for fingerprints, and sure enough, they found one on a napkin. Now, they also kept the chicken bones in hopes that in the future they would come in handy, but for right now, they had no ability to test the DNA on it. They just hoped that it would be beneficial in the future, but they had no idea. There were also a shoe print of a Nike shoe found at the crime scene. It was near the register, and it was said to be a Nike Air Force size 12 to 14, made between June 1990 and November 1992. It wasn't heavily worn, and it also said Force on the tongue. They theorized that this man who had worn it stood anywhere between 6 feet to 6'6". Now, there was also a reward of $100,000 announced, and tips were highly encouraged because not many were coming in by this point. Brown's Chicken franchise found that this would affect them more than they ever believed it could. They said that sales dropped about 35%, and within months they had to close around 100 restaurants in the Illinois area. And 300 former employees of this certain Brown's Chicken restaurant had to be interrogated because they could possibly have motive to want to kill their former employers. A man named Juan Luna came in at February 17th, 9 days after the murders, to be questioned, and he came with a woman named Anne with him, and he gave fingerprints, but his fingerprints did not match the napkin, and he was released. There was also a woman who came in named Eileen Bacala, who was interviewed, and she came in with two men, one named James Degorski and one named Juan Luna, the same man who had been interrogated previously. Eileen said she was with Juan and James that night. She picked him up from a grocery store. They headed back to her house, and that's all they did for that entire night. Now, Juan had been a previous employee of Brown's Chicken, so we know why he was interrogated. However, I'm not exactly sure why Eileen was. The case went unsolved for years following this, and 5 years later, it was now 1998, and the chicken that had been kept was now tested for DNA because of the advances in the technology, and a DNA profile was created from it, which meant that they just needed to find a match now, and they could confirm that it was the man who ate this chicken. And of course they would have to figure out if that was the killer, but they could confirm it was the DNA on this chicken, meaning they were there. Now, a man named John Simonic was brought in to be interrogated as well, and he was really being looked into as a suspect. Now, he claimed he had nothing to do with it. However, his friend named Todd would be interviewed, and Todd would say that he was there the night of the murders around 9 p.m. and Michael took his order, and that he was most likely the last person to eat there. But then John was interviewed again, and he said that he actually went with Todd to Brown's Chicken. But he said he waited in the parking lot, John went in to get the food, and he came back and he had a bunch of money, and that's all John said he knew. But then, when he was interviewed again, his story changed. John then said he did go into the restaurant, but he went into the bathroom, and then he heard gunshots, and he came out, and everybody was practically dead. And then he fired one shot into a pan that was above the deep fryer, and this, in fact, was where a bullet was found. This is not something that had been released to the public, and it was very telling that John knew that this bullet was there. Now, the strange thing was, the stories kept changing between John and Todd. They didn't know what was the truth at this point, but they did know that Todd's girlfriend was a woman named Casey Sanders. The same Casey who was supposed to work at Brown's Chicken that night, but Rico had taken her spot. The same one who had said that she almost went into the restaurant around 9 p.m. but thought better of it. Well, after several interrogations, Casey actually said that she did go in to talk to Lynn that day, and that Todd was with her, that Todd was talking to Michael and Rico when he got angry and began shooting and forcing people into the freezer, and that is when she got up and she ran home, and then that's when she said that they followed her home. But then they said, "Who's they?" And she said, "Oh, just Todd." In 1999, John Simonic was arrested for these murders because he would confess on tape saying that he did have much more to do with it than he originally let on, but that he didn't have his own gun and basically he wasn't the one to shoot. Now, ultimately, John started giving these confessions that conflicted one another, and they couldn't tell what was the truth, what was a lie, and they let him go because they just didn't feel like he was guilty. But since they let him go, they were now so many years into this investigation, and they still had nothing. However, 3 years after this, in 2002, they would get a huge tip because a woman would call in, actually two women would call in, but the main one that was talking was a woman named Ann Lockett. And Ann would say that her former boyfriend and his friend had killed 7 people at Brown's Chicken, and that she couldn't hold it in any longer. Her former boyfriend's name? James Degorski, a name that we've heard before. And James's friend's name? Juan Luna. That's right, 2 names we have heard before. Juan Luna had been interrogated previously, and James had come in with Juan to the interrogation of Eileen Bacala. So they had all been at one point, or they had both been at one point, investigated or in the department at the same time that this investigation was going on. Was this a coincidence or not? Anne was actually the woman that was with Juan when he was interrogated first, and she said she had been told by her former boyfriend James that he had done something big. Anne told the story of how that night she was in a psychiatric and substance abuse hospital when she would get a call from James, who had told her that he had done something and to watch the news that night. And when she did, all of the news was talking about were these murders. And so she called her mom and she said, please save all of the newspapers you can on this so I can read into it more and figure out what actually happened. And a few days later, she got out of this hospital and she was invited over to her boyfriend's house, or her boyfriend's parents' house, where he lived in the basement. And that is when she saw James, and Juan was also in the room, and they asked her, would you like to know what happened? And she said yes, which is something she says she regrets to this day, because they would go on to tell her in detail what had happened. She said James also had a .38 caliber gun and knives, and that they started to explain what they did, and they said that that night they felt like they wanted to ice someone, and so they got into James's car and they drove to Brown's Chicken. This is when they would order, and Juan would be eating his chicken, and then James began to get worried that he would leave his greasy fingerprints everywhere. So after they were done eating, they threw it away and they went to the bathroom to wash their hands and put on gloves. James said that he slit Lynn's throat and that they both shot people, and that they then fled and threw the gun in the Fox River. After so many years had gone by with the investigators having no idea what had happened, they jumped at this immediately. They went and they arrested Juan and James to bring them in and have them tested as far as their DNA, which was now able to be tested from the chicken. And Juan's DNA profile matched that on the chicken itself. And after so many years, they believed they had their killers. Then a woman named Eileen Bacala came forward saying she had also heard a confession from these 2 men. This was the same Eileen that had also been questioned previous to this and had Juan and James with her when she went to the police station. She said that night she did go pick them up at the grocery store, but she saw that in Juan's car there was actually gloves in the back seat, and they got in with a bag. And when Eileen asked them what the bag was for or what it had in it, they said that it was money from Brown's Chicken. James paid $50 to Eileen, which he owed her, and then after going back to her home, splitting the money between Juan and James, they took Juan back to his vehicle where he went home, and then they were driving around together. And that is when they drove by Brown's Chicken and saw the chaos there with the ambulances, the police cars, and Eileen realized that it was much worse than what James was letting on, and that it wasn't simply a robbery. James told Eileen that Juan had gone crazy and slit a woman's throat and killed 5 people, but he killed the other 2. Now, they brought Anne in, the first girl who had said that these 2 men had confessed to her, and they tapped her phones and wanted her to call James and said, we need you to get him to confess over the phone, to actually say it, whether, you bring it up and he says something, or whether you had to coax it out of him, we need something from him. And so she tried this, but James continued to say he had no idea what she was talking about, and he wouldn't say much more. Basically, it was thought he knew that something was wrong, or that she was not just asking him innocently. So they went and picked him up for questioning once again, and they brought him in, and within minutes he was crying, and he had his head in his hands, and he was basically asking God to forgive him, and then he confessed to the murders. He said he did bring his own gun to the murders and that the story was pretty much exactly how Anne and Eileen had said it. James also said when the police were questioning Juan, he told Anne to go with him in order to make him seem more innocent and more likable. At this point, Juan was also brought in for questioning, and he would say that he was actually assaulted by an officer during interrogation, and James, while in jail, actually had to have surgery on his jaw due to an injury that was allegedly from an officer as well. Now, I'm not sure if this was the same officer or not. Juan did confess to the murders on video, and it was like a 4-hour-long tape, and he also had his fingerprints tested once again just to make sure, because of course he tested originally, it didn't match to the napkin, but the second time it did, and that was because the fingerprint on the napkin was actually a partial palm print. And when they realized that, they tested against his palm and realized that that actually was a match. So who were these killers? What possibly made them that way? Well, looking into their past, at the time of the murders, James was 20 years old. He was a handyman and he already had a criminal record as well as a violent past. He abused his girlfriend. He also stole vehicles and he was arrested for a DUI. And his former boss actually said that James once asked him, if somebody killed somebody, will God let them into heaven? Juan was 19 years old at the time of the murders, and he actually knew James from high school. They became friends in high school. But he had been from Mexico, and so English was his second language, which made it really hard to succeed in school. He had a really hard time. Juan was the one who worked at Brown's Chicken for a while, but he wasn't actually fired from this job. There was no bad blood, no beef between him and the employers. He actually quit because he wanted to get a higher paying job. Some said he was sweet and gentle. Others said he abused animals in his past, and there really wasn't a clear picture of who Juan was. For the most part, it appeared as though he was a follower who really just went along with what everybody else was doing and whatever got him to be the most successful. And he also had no criminal record. However, because Juan had worked at Brown's Chicken previously and he was actually one of the first employees, this made a little more sense and gave investigators a little bit of insight into the actual murders, because they believed he actually knew Lynn and Michael. Lynn was the owner, Michael was the first employee there, and they believed that that is why Lynn's throat was slit and why Michael was stabbed, because he needed to make sure that they were deceased because they could be the ones to identify him. Everybody else didn't know who he was. Maybe he had never worked with Richard. I'm not sure why he wouldn't have done anything to Richard, but this was just a theory investigators had. In 2007, Juan was taken to trial, and he was being tried for premeditated murder, not robbery gone wrong. And Juan Luna was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. Now, 2 years later, James was also found guilty of 7 counts of murder and was also given life in prison without parole. The officer that was said to injure James while in jail was dismissed, and a settlement was given to James of $451,000 in compensation. At Juan's trial, Lynn and Richard's daughter Joy said to Juan, "You are responsible for your own family's suffering. Your family will now join ours in the circle of grief," talking about the fact that he will be put away forever and he had a family, and that now he did it to his own family as well. Lynn and Richard's other daughter Jennifer said, "We all have our lives and families and work, but we know each other's pain, and there's an unspoken bond we all have together." The girls are said to wear copies of their mother's rings every year on their anniversary, and it's actually a little bird's nest containing 3 eggs that were for her 3 daughters. They said it's ironic that Juan and James would do this to their parents because they're the type of people that their parents would have helped. Brown's Chicken Restaurant is actually now a Chase Bank, and Michael Castro's family dedicated a tree to him in the local park that's near their house so they can always go and remember him there. His sister was extremely angry about the verdict, not because it was found guilty, of course, that's what they wanted, but because it was found that these were kids at the time that they committed this murder, and the fact that these kids could do this to another kid that possibly they knew from high school was just baffling to her. Guadalupe's wife actually never remarried. She didn't ever want to marry anybody else, and his children actually watched on the news as they had said that they had found their killer and were bringing them to justice, and they were so extremely excited. Marcus's mother said that her son will forever live on in her heart and her memory because they can't kill his memory. And I think that's true for all of these victims. They cannot take away their memories from their family. And that's something that's so powerful because unfortunately they did take their lives and they took loved ones away, which is so horrendous, but they can't take memories. That is something they cannot do and they will not do. And there's strength in that. There's a powerful feeling knowing that. I would love to hear what you think actually happened because we got so many different variations of this story that I'm not sure that there is even the truth in there. I'm not sure we were ever even told exactly what happened, and we definitely weren't told the motive, so other than the fact that they just wanted to do it, which is a horrendous thought. But I'm so happy that you guys requested this one so I could tell the victim stories because I had not even heard about this case before researching the previous case about the fast food killer, and I think that it's a story that needs to be told. So I'm happy I could do that. And I also want to say I'm so sorry for the background noise you hear. There are people outside because that's the only thing they can do in this quarantine is be outside, so they're mowing and they're playing. Just can't control it right now, so I'm doing my best. I still want to put out content for you guys, so if there's a little more background noise, please bear with me. It's not something that, I'm not acknowledging. I know it's there, but it's not something I can help, so I am trying my best. And also I do want to say that I know a lot of you get really excited when I post a lot and constantly, and I love doing that for you guys, and it makes me so happy that you care enough to watch them all the time. But I don't want that to come across as that I'm this always motivated person that doesn't have unproductive days, because I know right now I see a lot of people posting and I'm like, how do they have the energy to? And then I realized you guys probably think that about me, and I just want you to know that while researching this case, I had a day where I just stared at the computer screen and I didn't write a word. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it, so I just kind of had a lazy day and tried again the next day. And I want you to know that it's strange circumstances right now, and being unproductive is okay. And the people you think are being productive probably are having those days too. They just end up getting it done in some way. But if you can't even do that, that's completely fine. Take this time to just rest. So yeah, I hope that makes you guys feel a little better. I don't know if it made you feel bad that I uploaded a lot, but if it did, just know I was procrastinating so much while researching this case. Not because I don't care, because I really, really do, but it's just, it takes a lot. It takes a lot mentally out of you to research these murders, and I just simply couldn't do it one day. So I tried again the next, and I think that's what all we can do during this time. So yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know that, and hopefully it makes you feel better, and just to make you feel like you're not alone, because I know that we're all technically alone, but you're not, because I'm here for you, this community's here for you, and we all want the best for you. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.